I was 14 years old when I decided I couldn't take another day at Maplewood Children's Home. It wasn't the worst orphanage in Michigan, but it wasn't home either. I'd been there since I was 9, after my mom passed away from cancer, and they never found my dad. The staff wasn't cruel or anything, but there were too many kids, not enough attention, and this constant feeling that I was just a number on a file somewhere. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how running away from that place led me to discover something I never expected, something that changed everything I thought I knew about family and belonging. The night I left was cold, early November, with frost already forming on the windows. I'd been planning it for weeks, stashing away granola bars from the cafeteria, saving the $23 I'd earned doing odd jobs around the facility. I knew it wasn't much, but I had this idea that I could make it to my aunt's place in Ohio. She'd visited me twice after Mom died, bringing gifts and promises, but then the visit stopped. I figured if I just showed up on her doorstep, she'd have to help me. Looking back now, I realize how naive that plan was, but when you're 14 and desperate, logic doesn't always win. I waited until midnight when the night supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, did her rounds and settled into her office with her usual mug of tea and romance novel. I'd timed this routine for 3 weeks straight. The window in the bathroom on the second floor didn't lock properly. Everyone knew it, but nobody really cared because it was a 12-foot drop, and who would be crazy enough to jump? Me, apparently. I'd made a rope from bedsheets tied together, like something out of a movie, and I anchored it to the radiator pipe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the knots, but adrenaline has a funny way of making you stronger than you think you are. The descent was terrifying. The sheets twisted and swayed with every movement, and halfway down, I heard a seam start to rip. For a horrible second, I thought I was going to fall and break both my legs, but then my feet hit solid ground and I was free. Actually free. I stood there in the darkness behind Maplewood for maybe 30 seconds, just breathing, feeling the cold air burn my lungs, before I grabbed my backpack from where I'd hidden it behind the dumpster and started running. I didn't have a clear direction, just away from the schedules and the shared rooms and the pitying looks from social workers who saw dozens of kids just like me every single day. I made it about 6 miles before I had to stop. My legs were burning and my breath came in painful gasps. I'd followed the main road out of town, staying in the shadows whenever a car passed, which wasn't often at 2 in the morning. That's when I realized how unprepared I really was. It was freezing, probably 35 degrees, and my jacket was too thin. I hadn't thought about where I'd sleep or how I'd actually get to Ohio, which was still about 200 miles away. Panic started creeping in, that sick feeling in your stomach when you realize you've made a terrible mistake, but it's too late to turn back. That's when I saw the farm. Well, I saw the mailbox first, leaning at an angle on the side of the road with the name Morrison, barely visible in peeling paint. A long gravel driveway disappeared into darkness, lined with overgrown bushes and trees. Something about it called to me, maybe because it looked abandoned, forgotten, like a place where someone like me could hide for a while and figure things out. I was so tired and cold that I didn't even think about the risks. I just turned down that driveway and kept walking. The main house appeared after about a quarter mile, a large 2-story farmhouse that must have been beautiful once, but now sagged in places, with shutters hanging loose and paint peeling in long strips. There were no lights on anywhere, no cars in the driveway, no signs of life at all. Behind it, I could see the dark shapes of a barn and a couple of smaller buildings. The whole property had this eerie, forgotten quality, like time had just stopped there years ago and nobody had bothered to wind it back up. Perfect, I thought. I could spend the night in the barn, rest up, and in the morning I'd figure out my next move. The barn door was stuck but not locked, and after some pushing it scraped open just enough for me to slip through. Inside, it smelled like old hay and motor oil, and something else I couldn't identify, something almost sweet, but also wrong. I used my phone's flashlight to look around, trying to conserve the battery. There were old farm tools hanging on the walls, a rusted tractor that looked like it hadn't run in decades, and a ladder leading up to a hayloft. I climbed up, found a relatively clean corner with some dusty blankets that someone had left behind, and wrapped myself up as best I could. I should have felt scared, alone in a strange abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, but mostly I just felt exhausted. I remember thinking that at least here nobody was going to wake me up at 6:30 for breakfast and chores. Nobody was going to ask me how I was feeling or if I'd thought about my future. Here, I could just be nobody for a while. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind rattle the barn walls, and fell into a deep sleep. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the barn walls and the sound of voices. My heart jumped into my throat and I froze, barely breathing, pressing myself flat against the hay. The voices were coming from outside, getting closer, a man and a woman, talking in low tones that I couldn't quite make out. I'd been so sure this place was abandoned, but clearly I'd been wrong. Panic flooded through me as I realized I was trespassing, and worse, I had nowhere to go. If they called the police, I'd be back at Maplewood by lunch. "The back fence needs fixing before winter really hits," the man was saying, his voice deep and tired sounding. "And we need to check on the generator. Last thing we need is to lose power again." The woman murmured something I couldn't hear, and then their footsteps crunched past the barn toward one of the other buildings. I waited, barely moving, for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. When I finally convinced myself they'd gone, I crept to the edge of the loft and looked down. That's when I saw her. A girl, maybe 16 or 17, standing in the doorway of the barn, looking right up at me. She had long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and was wearing jeans and a heavy flannel jacket. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I waited for her to scream or run for help. Instead, she put her finger to her lips in a shushing gesture and climbed up the ladder to the loft. "You picked a really interesting place to hide," she whispered when she reached the top. Her eyes weren't angry or scared, just curious. "I'm Sarah, and before you freak out, I'm not going to tell anyone you're here. But you should know that my parents are pretty observant, so if you're planning to stay, we need to be smart about it." I must have looked completely shocked, because she smiled slightly. "I saw you come in last night. My bedroom window faces the barn. I figured you were running from something." I didn't know what to say. This wasn't how I'd imagined being discovered. "I'm Emma," I finally managed. "And I'm sorry, I didn't think anyone lived here. The place looked abandoned, and I just needed somewhere to sleep for the night. I'll leave right now, I promise." But Sarah shook her head and sat down cross-legged on the hay, gesturing for me to do the same. "You ran away from somewhere, didn't you? Group home? Foster care?" When I nodded slowly, she sighed. "Yeah, I kind of figured. Look, I know we don't know each other, but I also know what it's like to feel trapped. This farm, it's complicated. We're kind of hiding here too, in a way." Over the next hour, Sarah told me a story that seemed impossible. Her family, the Morrisons, had lived on this farm for generations, but 8 years ago everything changed. Her father, David, had worked as an accountant for a large corporation in Detroit, and he'd discovered something he shouldn't have. Financial fraud, millions of dollars being funneled through fake accounts, involving people powerful enough to make problems disappear. Sarah was vague on the details, but the message was clear. Her father had tried to do the right thing, tried to go to the authorities, and instead found himself and his family being threatened. "We disappeared," Sarah said quietly. "My parents pulled me and my younger brother out of school one day. We drove for hours, and we ended up here. My grandfather had left my dad this farm when he died, but nobody in the family had lived here for years. It was perfect. Remote, forgotten, under my grandfather's name rather than my dad's. We've been here ever since, staying off the grid as much as possible." She looked at me with those serious eyes. "We don't have internet. We don't use our real names when we occasionally go into town, and we definitely don't let people know we're here. So you being in our barn, it's actually kind of a big deal." I felt terrible. These people were hiding from something dangerous, and I'd stumbled right into their sanctuary. "I'm so sorry," I said again. "I'll leave right now. I won't tell anyone I saw you, I promise." But Sarah grabbed my arm gently. "Wait. The thing is, I've been watching you for the last hour while you slept, thinking about what to do. And I realized something. You're running from your own problems, just like we are. Maybe we can help each other. My mom is actually really kind, and she's always talking about how we should help people when we can. Let me talk to her first, okay? Just stay here and stay quiet." She climbed back down the ladder and disappeared, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. What were the chances that I'd randomly chosen a farm where another family was hiding from their own troubles? It felt too coincidental, like something out of a book rather than real life. I sat there, my stomach growling, realizing I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, and my granola bars were already gone. I was debating whether I should just slip out while I had the chance when Sarah returned, this time with a woman who must have been her mother. Janet Morrison was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and worry lines etched deep around her mouth. She climbed up to the loft with a grace that surprised me and sat down, studying my face carefully. "Sarah tells me you're running from a children's home," she said gently, "and that you're alone. Is that true?" I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time since I'd left Maplewood. There was something about her voice, something motherly that I hadn't heard in 5 years, that just broke something inside me. "I'm not going to ask you why you ran," Janet continued. "I'm sure you had your reasons, but I am going to tell you that a 14-year-old girl traveling alone is dangerous, especially with winter coming. Sarah convinced me that we should offer you something. A place to stay, at least for a little while, until you figure out what you want to do. But you need to understand what you'd be getting into. This isn't a normal situation. We're hiding here, and if you stay, you'd be hiding with us. Hey, if you're enjoying Emma's story so far, I'd absolutely love it if you could hit that subscribe button. This channel is all about real stories from real people who've been through incredible situations. And I want to know, what would you do if you discovered a family hiding on an abandoned farm? Would you stay and help them, or would you keep running? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives. Seriously, this community is amazing, and I'm so grateful you're here sharing this journey with me. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because things are about to get even more complicated. I stayed. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was the smartest decision or the most reckless one I'd ever made. But in that moment, sitting in that hayloft with Janet Morrison looking at me with genuine concern, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. She brought me into the main house, which looked even more run down on the inside than it did from the outside, but it was clean and warm and smelled like coffee and cinnamon. Sarah's younger brother, Marcus, was 12 years old, with the same dark hair as his sister, and a suspicious look in his eyes that told me he wasn't as trusting as the rest of his family. David Morrison was a tall, thin man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years. When Janet brought me into the kitchen, where he was fixing something under the sink, he stood up so fast he hit his head on the cabinet. "Janet, what is this?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "We talked about this. We can't just bring people here. It's not safe." But Janet put her hand on his arm and spoke to him in a low voice. And after several minutes of intense whispering, he turned to me with a resigned expression that clearly said this was against his better judgment. 2 weeks, he said firmly. "You can stay for 2 weeks while you figure out your next steps. We'll give you food and a place to sleep, but you have to follow our rules. You don't leave the property. You don't use any electronic devices that could be traced. You don't tell anyone about us. Not now, not ever. And if we feel at any point that you're putting our family at risk, you leave immediately. Understood?" I nodded so hard I felt dizzy. 2 weeks was more than I'd hoped for. 2 weeks was a lifetime when you'd been planning to sleep in a barn and had no idea where your next meal would come from. They set me up in a small room on the second floor that Sarah said used to be her grandfather's study. It had a twin bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the fields behind the house. It wasn't much, but it was mine, at least for now. That first night, Janet made a huge dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes, and I ate until I felt sick because I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a real home-cooked meal. Marcus watched me the whole time with those suspicious eyes, but Sarah kept trying to include me in the conversation, asking about my favorite music and movies, normal things that made me feel almost human again. The first few days were strange. I'd wake up early because that's what years at Maplewood had trained me to do, and I'd lie in bed, listening to the sounds of the Morrison family starting their day. David would be up first, checking the perimeter of the property like he did every single morning, walking the fence line and making sure nothing was disturbed. Janet would start breakfast while listening to a battery-powered radio, always tuned to news stations, always listening for something that I didn't understand. Sarah would help with chores, feeding the chickens they kept in a coop behind the barn, collecting eggs, checking on the vegetable garden that Janet somehow kept alive even as winter approached. I tried to make myself useful. I'd help Janet with cooking and cleaning. I'd follow Sarah around, learning how to do farm chores. I'd even sit with Marcus while he did schoolwork from old textbooks they'd brought with them when they fled Detroit. Homeschooling, Janet explained, was the only option. They couldn't risk enrolling the kids in a real school where someone might ask questions or run background checks. Marcus was smart, maybe too smart, and he'd argue with his mother about history dates and math formulas with an intensity that made me smile despite everything. It was on the 5th day that I started noticing the weird things. Small things at first, like how David would disappear for hours at a time into the basement, and when I asked Sarah about it, she'd change the subject. Or how sometimes late at night I'd hear vehicles pulling up to the barn and voices, but in the morning there'd be no sign that anyone had been there. And then there was the locked room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the one that Janet specifically told me to never, under any circumstances, try to open. Of course, that made me want to open it more than anything. I'm not proud of my curiosity, but when you've spent 5 years in an institution where privacy doesn't exist and secrets are currency, you develop a nose for things people are trying to hide. I started paying closer attention. I noticed that Janet would sometimes go into that locked room with bags of groceries, way more food than our family of 5 could possibly eat. I noticed that the room had its own bathroom because I could hear water running through the pipes in the wall of my room, which was right next door. And I noticed that Sarah would sometimes stand outside that door for long minutes, just listening, before walking away with a sad expression on her face. On the 8th day, I couldn't take it anymore. It was early afternoon, and everyone was outside doing various chores. David had driven into town, which he did once a week to buy supplies, always paying cash, always wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Janet and Sarah were working in the garden, trying to harvest the last of the winter vegetables before the first hard freeze. Marcus was in the barn, doing something with the chickens. I had maybe 30 minutes alone in the house. I went upstairs and stood in front of that locked door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried the handle, knowing it wouldn't open, but I had to try. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I'd noticed that Janet kept a set of keys on a hook in the kitchen, keys for various locks around the property. I ran downstairs, grabbed them, and ran back up before I could talk myself out of it. My hands were shaking as I tried each key, and on the 4th try, I heard the lock click. The door swung open and I stepped inside. The room was bigger than mine, with better furniture and thick curtains drawn over the windows. There was a double bed neatly made, a small table with books stacked on it, and a chair by the window. And sitting in that chair, staring at me with the same shocked expression I must have had on my face, was a woman I'd never seen before. She looked to be in her 60s, with grey hair cut short, and a face that might have been beautiful once, but was now marked with deep lines of worry or pain. "Who are you?" we both said at the same time. She stood up quickly, and I saw that she was thin, too thin, like someone who'd been sick. "You're not supposed to be in here," she said, her voice hoarse like she hadn't used it much lately. "Janet will be so upset. David will—" She trailed off, and I saw real fear in her eyes. Not fear of me, but fear for me, which somehow made it worse. "Please," she said quietly, "please just leave and pretend you never saw me. It's safer that way. For both of us." But I couldn't move. I stood there frozen, staring at this hidden woman in this locked room, and suddenly everything about the Morrison family made a different kind of sense. They weren't just hiding from David's former employers. They were hiding someone. Someone important enough to lock away, someone dangerous enough to keep secret. And I had just stumbled into something way bigger and more complicated than a family on the run from corporate criminals. "Emma?" Sarah's voice came from downstairs, sharp with panic. "Emma, where are you?" I heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, and I knew I had about 5 seconds before I was caught. The woman in the room looked at me with pleading eyes, and I made a split-second decision. I stepped back out into the hallway, pulled the door closed, and locked it just as Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs. Sarah's face went pale when she saw me standing in front of that door with the keys in my hand. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do, what to say. Then she walked toward me slowly, like you'd approach a frightened animal, and gently took the keys from my hand. "You opened it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. It wasn't really a question. I nodded, unable to lie, and watched as her shoulders sagged. Okay. We need to talk to my parents, right now." The next hour was one of the most tense of my life. We sat in the living room, all 5 of us, plus me, and the silence was suffocating. David had his head in his hands, and I could see he was furious, though he was trying to control it. Janet kept looking at me with this expression of profound sadness, like I'd betrayed her somehow, which I guess I had. Marcus just looked scared. Finally, David raised his head and looked at me with exhausted eyes. "I told Janet this was a bad idea," he said. "I told her we couldn't trust a stranger in this house, not with what we're protecting, but she insisted, and now here we are." "David," Janet said softly, putting her hand on his knee. "She's just a child. She didn't know." But David shook his head. "She knew enough to go looking. She knew that door was locked for a reason, and she opened it anyway." He turned to me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what kind of danger you could have put all of us in?" I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I was curious and I was stupid and I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Who is she? The woman upstairs?" Janet and David exchanged a long look, having one of those silent conversations that only people who've been married for years can have. Finally, Janet sighed and turned to me. "Her name is Catherine Morrison. She's David's mother." I blinked, confused. "But Sarah said your grandfather left you this farm. Wouldn't that be her husband?" David nodded slowly. "My father died 11 years ago. My mother was supposed to die too. That's what everyone thinks. That's what the death certificate says. But she's alive, and she's been living in that room for the past 8 years. The story that unfolded over the next 2 hours was like something out of a thriller novel, except it was real and sitting right in front of me. When David had discovered the financial fraud at his company, it wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was a massive money laundering operation tied to some very dangerous people, the kind of people who don't hesitate to eliminate problems. When David had tried to blow the whistle, they'd come after his family, first with threats, then with action. Someone had broken into their house in Detroit. Someone had followed Sarah home from school. And then someone had tried to run Catherine Morrison off the road. "The accident was meant to kill her," David said, his voice hollow. "She was driving to the grocery store, and a truck ran her off the highway. Her car rolled 3 times. She was in the hospital for 2 months, in a coma for the first 3 weeks. The doctors said it was a miracle she survived, but she had severe injuries. Broken ribs, collapsed lung, traumatic brain injury. When she finally woke up, I knew we had to do something drastic." He looked at his mother's locked door. "So, we faked her death." Janet picked up the story. "We had a friend, a doctor who owed David a favor, who helped us. We created a death certificate, held a small funeral with a closed casket, and meanwhile, Catherine was recovering in a private facility under a false name. When she was stable enough to move, we brought her here. We'd already decided to disappear ourselves by then, so it made sense to bring her with us. She's been in that room ever since, because her injuries never fully healed. She has good days and bad days. On good days, she can walk around the house a little, read, talk with us. On bad days, she can barely get out of bed. I felt sick. This family hadn't just been running from corporate criminals. They'd been protecting a woman who was supposed to be dead, a woman who was still recovering from an assassination attempt. Why not go to the police? I asked. Why not get witness protection or something? David laughed bitterly. Because some of those dangerous people I mentioned, they have connections in law enforcement. We tried going through official channels at first. I reported what I found to the SEC, to the FBI, and somehow, within 48 hours, the people I was reporting knew exactly what I'd done. That's when I realized we were on our own. So we've been here ever since, Sarah added quietly, taking care of Grandma Catherine, staying hidden, trying to live some kind of normal life. It's not perfect, but it's safe, or at least it was, until she trailed off, looking at me. The implication was clear. Until I showed up and discovered their biggest secret. I felt the weight of that responsibility crushing down on me. These people had taken me in, fed me, given me shelter, and I'd repaid them by violating their privacy and potentially putting them all at risk. I won't tell anyone, I said desperately. I swear, I don't have anyone to tell anyway. I'm a runaway from an orphanage. Nobody's looking for me. Nobody cares where I am. Your secret is safe with me. But David shook his head. It's not that simple. The problem isn't whether you'll intentionally tell someone. The problem is what happens if someone comes looking for you. If the police start searching for a missing teenager, if your face ends up on the news or on missing person posters, and someone sees you here, connects you to us, starts asking questions about who we are and why we have a runaway staying with us, that kind of attention could unravel everything. The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed that truth. Marcus spoke up for the first time. So what do? We can't just kick her out. She knows about Grandma now. Isn't that more dangerous? David rubbed his face tiredly. I don't know, buddy. I honestly don't know. Janet stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields. Maybe, she said slowly, the answer is that Emma becomes part of our family. Officially. Everyone turned to look at her. What do you mean? David asked. Janet turned back to face us. I mean exactly what I said. Emma doesn't have anyone. We're already living under false identities. What if Emma Morrison, David's niece, came to live with us after her parents died? We homeschool her just like we do Marcus and Sarah. She becomes one of us. That way, if anyone does come looking for a runaway named Emma from Michigan, they won't find her. They'll find a completely different girl living a completely different life. I couldn't breathe. She was offering me more than just a place to stay. She was offering me a family, an identity, a whole new life. But David was already shaking his head. Janet, that's insane. We can't just adopt a child we found in our barn. There are legal processes, background checks, home studies. And we can't exactly go through official channels given our situation. But Janet crossed her arms, and I recognized that look. I'd seen my own mother wear it a few times before she got sick. It was the look of a woman who'd made up her mind. We don't go through official channels, Janet said firmly. We do it the same way we've done everything else for the past 8 years. We make it work. We create the paperwork we need. We tell the story we need to tell. And we protect this child the same way we're protecting Catherine, because that's what we do, David. We protect the people who need protecting. It's who we are. She looked at me with those kind eyes. Emma, I know this is a lot to take in, and I know you didn't ask for any of this. But if you want to stay, truly stay, as part of this family, we'll make it happen. It won't be easy, and it won't be normal, but you'll be safe, and you'll be loved. What do you say? I looked around at the faces staring at me. Sarah was smiling hopefully. Marcus still looked suspicious, but also curious. David looked conflicted, but not entirely opposed. And Janet looked like she'd already started planning how to make this impossible thing possible. Upstairs, behind a locked door, was a woman who was supposed to be dead but wasn't, a grandmother I'd only just met who was part of this strange, broken, beautiful family. And suddenly I realized something. I'd run away from Maplewood looking for my aunt in Ohio, looking for someone, anyone, who might want me. But maybe I'd been running toward this all along. Toward a family that understood what it meant to be lost and found at the same time. Yes, I whispered. Yes, I want to stay. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change and adjustment. Janet wasn't kidding when she said she knew how to make things work. She had connections I didn't fully understand, people from her and David's old life who owed them favors or believed in their cause. Within 10 days, I had a new birth certificate listing me as Emma Morrison, born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to David's fictional younger brother who had died along with his wife in a car accident 2 years prior. It was eerily similar to Catherine's fake death, and I wondered if that's where Janet had gotten the idea. Learning to be part of the Morrison family was harder than I expected. It wasn't just about having a new last name or memorizing a fake backstory. It was about understanding the rhythms of their daily life, the unspoken rules that governed everything they did. Never answer the door if someone knocked. Never give real names to the rare visitors who did show up, like the propane delivery guy, or the man who came to service the well pump. Always be aware of your surroundings. Always have an escape plan. It was exhausting, living with that level of constant vigilance, but it also made me feel like I mattered. Like my safety was important enough to fight for. Sarah became my closest friend, teaching me everything from how to can vegetables for the winter to how to identify the sound of different vehicles coming up the driveway. She told me about her old life in Detroit, the friends she'd left behind without explanation, the school plays she'd been in, the normal teenage experiences she'd sacrificed for her family's safety. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window with this expression of profound longing, and I knew she was wondering what her life would have been like if her father had never discovered that fraud, if they'd never had to run. Marcus eventually warmed up to me, though it took almost 3 weeks. The turning point came when I helped him with a particularly difficult algebra problem that even Janet had been struggling with. Math had always been my strongest subject at Maplewood, one of the few things I was genuinely good at, and seeing Marcus's face light up when he finally understood the concept made something warm bloom in my chest. After that, he started seeking me out for help with homework, and then just to talk, telling me about the books he was reading or the things he wanted to do when they could finally stop hiding. Catherine, David's mother, my grandmother now, was the biggest surprise. Once the secret was out, Janet said there was no point keeping us separated anymore, and Catherine became a regular part of our family dinners. She moved slowly and sometimes had trouble remembering words, lasting effects of her brain injury. But her mind was sharp and her sense of humor was wicked. She told me stories about David as a child, embarrassing tales that made him groan and made the rest of us laugh until our sides hurt. She taught me how to knit, something she'd been doing to keep her hands busy during her long recovery, and we'd sit together in the evenings, needles clicking, while she shared wisdom about life and loss and holding on to hope, even when everything seems impossible. David was the last one to fully accept me, but I understood why. He carried the weight of everyone's safety on his shoulders, and adding another person to that burden couldn't have been easy. But gradually, I saw him relax around me. He started including me in his morning perimeter checks, teaching me what to look for, how to spot signs that someone had been on the property. He showed me where they kept the emergency supplies, the cash they'd hidden in various locations around the house and barn, the escape routes they'd planned for different scenarios. "I hope you never need any of this," he told me one cold December morning as we walked the fence line. "But if something happens, you need to know how to protect yourself and this family." By Christmas, which we celebrated quietly with a small tree that Marcus and I had cut from the woods behind the property, I couldn't remember what my old life had felt like. Maplewood seemed like something from another lifetime, a bad dream that had happened to someone else. I was Emma Morrison now, part of a family that had chosen me just as much as I'd chosen them. We exchanged modest gifts, handmade things mostly, and sang carols around the piano that Janet played beautifully. Catherine cried happy tears, saying it was the best Christmas she'd had since before her accident, and even David smiled more than I'd ever seen him smile. But I'd be lying if I said everything was perfect. There were still hard days when I missed my mother so much it physically hurt, days when Sarah would snap at me over nothing because she was tired of being trapped on this farm, days when Marcus would have nightmares about the men who'd threatened them in Detroit, days when David would disappear into the basement for hours because the stress of it all was too much. We were a family, built from broken pieces, held together by necessity and hope and a stubborn refusal to let the bad guys win. One night in early January, almost 3 months after I'd climbed through that barn window, I sat in my room, looking out at the stars over the empty field. Sarah knocked and came in, sitting on my bed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Running away from the orphanage? Ending up here with us and all our crazy baggage?" I thought about it for a long moment. Really thought about it. Did I regret leaving Maplewood? Did I regret discovering the Morrisons and their impossible secrets? Did I regret becoming part of a family that lived in constant fear of being found? No, I said finally, and I meant it. I don't regret it, because for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I belong somewhere. Like I'm not just a number on a file or a problem to be managed. I'm part of something real, something worth protecting. That's more than I ever had before. Sarah smiled and squeezed my hand. "Good," she said, "because we're not letting you go. You're stuck with us, Emma Morrison, for better or worse. And you know what? I was okay with that. More than okay. Because sometimes family isn't about blood or legality or doing things the normal way. Sometimes family is about finding people who will fight for you, who will keep your secrets while you keep theirs, who will make room for you at their table even when they're barely holding it together themselves." The Morrison family had given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a place to belong, people who cared whether I lived or died, a reason to wake up in the morning and believe that tomorrow might be better than today. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if David's enemies will ever find us, or if we'll spend the rest of our lives hiding on this isolated farm. I don't know if Catherine will fully recover, or if we'll eventually have to say goodbye to her. I don't know if Sarah and Marcus will ever get to live normal lives, go to real schools, make friends who aren't hiding from the world. But I do know this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Because that's what families do, even the weird, unconventional, technically illegal ones like ours. I ran away from an orphanage at 14 years old, found an isolated farm, and discovered a shocking, hidden family. But more than that, I found myself. I found my strength, my purpose, my place in a world that had felt cold and unwelcoming for so long. And if you're out there reading this, feeling lost or alone, or like you don't fit anywhere, I want you to know something. Your family's out there. It might not look like what you expected. It might come with complications and challenges you never imagined. But it's there, waiting for you to find it. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to climb through the window and see where you land. If this story touched your heart in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel. This community is built on shared experiences, on the courage to tell our truths and listen to others tell theirs. I'd love for you to be part of it. And please, if you feel comfortable, share your own story in the comments. Have you ever found family in unexpected places? Have you ever had to choose between safety and honesty? What did you learn from Emma's journey? Your stories matter, and this community is here to listen and support each other. Thank you so much for being here, for watching, and for being part of this incredible family we're building together. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people you love.